It is now my pleasure to introduce more of the Non-In3 team, Acting Director Nadia and Research Assistant Sam Mason, who together will take us through what we've learnt about the effectiveness of the game to alter attitudes by the analysis of the data that was captured through the game trials. So welcome, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for everybody coming along, particularly on a lovely evening when you should all be outside. Can you see which one it is? That's one, yeah. So I'm doing this without my glasses on, so you're going to be having fun. So really what Sam and I are going to be doing for you now is talking you through our trialling of the game in schools. And as you can imagine, we've been doing this during COVID and as we've been coming out of COVID. So it was difficult. And so, as Jill said, thank you to all the pupils and teachers who actually took part in our study. So our objective in doing the game trials was actually to examine the effectiveness of this context-specific pro-social video game called Danielle. And we wanted to see how whether or not it improved attitudes towards sexual abuse, both online and offline, and psychological abuse, again, online and offline, and physical abuse and controlling behaviours in young people. We also wanted to determine whether or not Danielle actually improves levels of affective and cognitive responsiveness and empowerment and resilience. And I've just knocked Sam's notes on the floor. I'm really sorry, Sam, you duck. So, as you've been gathering, the game's been played in chapters. The game itself consists of 5 chapters, and how we went about this randomised controlled trial is we went into schools and randomly allocated young people to either the control group or the intervention group. And it was the intervention group who played the video game. The control group also completed our psychometric surveys for the outcome measures, but they just carried on with their normal curriculum in place of the game. So we started at the first day of the week, usually on a Monday, and the first chapter was played after the young people had filled in the Time 1 survey. They then played 1 chapter per day throughout the week, and on the Friday following chapter 5, the intervention group completed the Time 2 survey, and the control group also on that same Friday completed the same survey. We then went back to the schools the following week to capture data at a 1-week follow-up, and then again another 4 weeks later. So we were capturing data at baseline, immediately after gameplay, 1 week later and 4 weeks later.
So with regards to participants, initially 286 people complete the first survey. 144 of these go on to play the video game, and 142 go on to just take part in the normal curriculum and take part in the surveys, and they act as our control group. Following this, we also had 9 additional people who were supposed to be within the group who played the video game, who turned up after the first survey. And due to our protocols, we did allow them to play the video game, but didn't actually record any survey responses from them. For the purpose of discussing the results today, we're going to be focusing on 2 main cohorts. So the first one consists of 123 young people who played the video game and 100 young people who did not, who completed the first 3 surveys. And this consists of 114 boys and 109 girls aged between 13 and 16 years. And the other cohort whose results we'll be discussing is 81 young people who play the video game and 70 who do not, who completed all 4 time points. The reason for disparity in the number of people who complete 3 surveys and or 4 surveys is that due to COVID-19, it meant that we were unable, in some schools we were actually unable to have the young people complete time point 4 within the actual protocol guidelines. So these young people were sampled from 7 secondary schools across the UK.
So in terms of the measures that we used, we did collect demographic data such as gender, age and ethnicity. We also used a newly validated tool, which has been designed by Jill and the team, called the Modern Adolescent Dating Violence Attitude Scale. And this captured young people's attitudes towards online and offline sexual abuse, online and offline psychological abuse, physical abuse and controlling behaviour. In addition, we use the previously validated Ni3UK Victim Responsiveness Assessment, and this measures both affective and cognitive responsiveness. So effective responsiveness is the ability to respond to a situation with appropriate feeling. So it asks young people about whether or not they feel sympathy, sadness or upset towards those who are being abused by their partner. In contrast, cognitive responsiveness, responsiveness is empathy and understanding of others' emotional states. So these questions asked whether young people understood what those who are being abused by a partner were actually going through. In addition to this, we ask questions about people's sense of empowerment and resilience having taken part in the game.
So in terms of the results, so for sexual abuse in an offline context, our results suggest that playing the video game does not actually influence or change attitudes towards offline sexual abuse. And what we mean by this is that young people tended to either strongly disagree or disagree with all statements regarding sexual abuse offline. And this was whether they were playing the video game or whether they just took part in the normal curriculum. And as such, what we could conclude from that is that there is generally a low tolerance for attitudes justifying sexual abuse. So one of the main reasons that we suspect that we found this is because there's quite a lot of information available to young people about what consent is and what consent isn't these days. So the idea of it being freely given, it can be retracted, it should be enthusiastically given, and so on and so forth. And also things such as the Me Too social movement, which has definitely potentially influenced what young people think about offline sexual abuse. What we do find is that playing the Danielle video game does contribute to changing attitudes towards online sexual abuse. And what we actually find here is that the attitudes improve positively among young people who play the video game compared to those who do not. And we find that these attitudes improve following completion of the video game and over the following weeks. This is really promising as you saw from the games team presentation, the game tackles the subject of sharing explicit photos on social media and coercion to actually send these photos in the first place. So this is quite a good finding. So what we actually mean when we actually say that attitudes improve is basically what we're saying is that at baseline, so this is before anyone plays the game, mean scores are quite similar. So for all of the adolescent dating violence concepts, young people answered 8 items, so they could score between 8 and 40 overall. So as you can see here, there's not a massive difference in score before anybody plays the game. However, by time point 2, which is after completing the game, the group who play the game, which is demonstrated by the red line, they see quite a dip in mean score. So this means that they're more likely to strongly disagree or disagree with statements that justify sexual abuse in an online context. And what we then find as time progresses, so 1 week later, and in the bottom graph, in time point 4, which is 1 month after completing the game, we actually see that these attitudes continue to decrease, so even less tolerance of attitudes justifying sexual abuse online. So what we find when it comes to physical abuse is, again, our results suggest that playing the video game doesn't have any influence on changing attitudes towards physical abuse. And similarly with sexual abuse in an offline context, this is because there is a low tolerance for these attitudes generally. So regardless of whether the young people play the video game or they don't, they are more likely to say that they strongly disagree or disagree to attitudes that justify these behaviours. What we do know is that awareness among young people that physical abuse is wrong is quite prevalent. So they'll be aware of things such as corporal punishment not being a thing within schools, and smacking generally being quite frowned upon within the home environment. However, what we do actually see in young people who play the video game is that in the later time points, they go on to consider the idea of violence in a self-defense context. So one of the items actually says, just to paraphrase, is there ever a circumstance in which it's okay to hit a girl? And what we actually found was that young people who played the game, some of them did provide us with annotations about self-defense and so on and so forth. With regards to psychological abuse, we find that playing the Danielle video game does contribute to changing attitudes towards psychological abuse. And again, we find that these attitudes improve positively among young people who play the video game compared to those who just have their regular curriculum. And these improvements in attitude are recorded following completion of the video game and 1 week later. While we don't find a particularly drastic reduction in the weeks that followed that, we do find that attitudes stabilise and they don't return to pre-intervention or pre-video game levels. And again, this is quite promising because what we find is that psychological abuse is quite a consistent theme throughout the video game, and this is demonstrated by plot points including the scene that you saw in the coffee shop where James made a bit of a show of Danielle in front of her friends. Also during the video game, she's accused of cheating. James actually flirts with another girl in front of her. He criticises her appearance, he puts her down, and so on and so forth. And again, being able to see these signs of abuse in an online gaming context, perhaps these being confronted with these particular forms of abuse, being able to demonstrate attitudinal change. So with regards to psychological abuse online, again, we find that attitudes improve positively among young people who play the video game compared to those who do not. And again, this is following completion of the video game and 1 week later. And what we also find is that this result is also observed in boys who play the video game. Now, what I would like to stress with this is it's not that girls' attitudes do not change, it's just that the boys' attitudes change at a greater rate, so they're more likely to disagree or strongly disagree with attitudes justifying psychological abuse. And finally, with regards to the adolescent dating violence scales, we find that playing the Danielle video game contributes to changing attitudes towards controlling behaviours. So again, attitudes improve positively among young people who play the video game compared to those who just have their normal curriculum. And this is recorded following completion of the video game and over the following weeks. And quite an interesting finding here is that this result is also observed in girls who play the video game following completion of the game and 1 week later. And again, it's not that boys do not see a positive change in their attitudes, it's just that the attitudes of girls change at a greater rate. So what we actually find is that during the playing of the Danielle video game, young people see behaviours such as Danielle being isolated from a friend by James, being made to feel guilty for seeing her friends, and also things such as James going through her phone both physically and via the application of spyware. And what we hypothesised could have happened here is that previously girls could have misinterpreted some of these behaviours as them actually being protective and loving behaviours from a partner rather than actually the abusive behaviours and controlling and possessive behaviours that they actually are. So in terms of effective responsiveness, so whether young people feel upset, feel sad or feel sympathetic towards victims of intimate partner violence, what we find here is that there is no effect of playing the video game on these levels. And in fact, rather than an increase in levels of effective responsiveness that we would expect to see, the levels actually decrease over time. Now, there could be a number of reasons for this. So it could be argued that some of the themes pertinent within Danielle don't appear to translate to showing empathy for victims of intimate partner violence. However, we would think that this could be majorly discarded, mostly because when we were observing young people actually playing the game, it doesn't match up with some of the quite visceral reactions that we observed during gameplay. What's quite a lot more likely, and what we found when doing a bit of a deeper level analysis of the findings, is that wordings of some of the items appear to have influenced responsiveness. So within a couple of the items, it actually mentions things like, I feel like crying, or I cry. And what we actually saw was that when these statements are responded to, more than a third of young people aren't actually sure what they make of this statement, so they choose neither agree nor disagree. When it comes to cognitive responsiveness, so the idea of can young people put themselves in the shoes of somebody who is being abused, what we find is that playing the video game improves levels of cognitive responsiveness, but only in boys who complete the first 3 surveys. By the 4th survey, what we find is that cognitive responsiveness, it has decreased, but it doesn't return to pre-gaming levels. When we analyse all of the results, so with all participants, we find that the video game has no impact. Now, again, what I'd quite like to stress here is that this isn't necessarily bad. It could just be that young people may have thought while responding, do you know what, I can't even begin to imagine what somebody being abused is going through, and as such they respond accordingly, rather than saying, you know, I could imagine what they're feeling, imagine what they're thinking, and so on and so forth. And what we might want to conclude by this is that cognitive responsiveness is perhaps a trait that's easier if the particular form of abuse that they're being asked to empathise with is something that they either have first-hand or second-hand experience of. With regards to empowerment and resilience, we find that there's no effect of playing the video game on these levels. What we do find is that there's an initial improvement, but it's observed in all young people who take part in the surveys, not just those who play the video game. One of the main reasons we find for a lack of empowerment and resilience is that young people appear to be unsure whether they're confident that a teacher will be able to help a girl in an abusive relationship. Similarly to what we were talking about before about the statements regarding crying, when young people see this statement, around a third of them at baseline say that they neither agree nor disagree. And while this does improve, even at time points 3 and 4, around 1/5 still aren't sure with regards to answering this particular statement.
Thank you, Sam. So we also decided to look at the findings regarding the demographic characteristics of the young people, so particularly splitting the data by gender and age group. There was only a couple of people that were age 16. So the reality is we've only really looked at age groups separating them out by 13, 14 and 15 years of age. What we have found is that boys and older adolescents, those who are age 15, were actually more likely to endorse statements justifying all forms of adolescent dating violence compared to both girls and younger adolescents. Now, if you look at the literature previously, it's often said that we actually need to target older age adolescents, so those around about 15. But maybe it's because these people are actually engaging in these dating behaviours which become abusive. And so they're sort of seeing these as normalised, like you just said, actually, Sam, earlier, the fact that these are seen as forms of love and protection rather than actual abuse. Also, girls reported high levels of affective responsiveness in comparison to boys, so they were much more likely to feel upset, sad or sympathetic towards victims of abuse. And again, this is concordant with other research findings that shows that females are far less likely to engage in victim blame because they have high levels of victim empathy. So in summary, actually what we seem to be saying is that playing Danielle, this pro-social video game, has improved attitudes towards online sexual abuse, psychological abuse, both online and offline, and controlling behaviours. So playing Danielle has been particularly improved boys' attitudes towards psychological online abuse and increased cognitive responsiveness, such as their levels of empathy and understanding of another person's emotional state. Importantly, Danielle's improves girls' understanding of controlling behaviour. So like you said, Sam, they're no longer labelling this as normal and as a positive experience in their relationship. Now, all of these findings have been found based on these young people just playing the game for between 2.5 and 3.5 hours across 1 week. There was no other supporting activities to go alongside this, and that's not how we envisaged the game being played. So the findings, so whilst demonstrating just a modest impact of Danielle, they give us really quiet optimism. The way in which we had to conduct our randomised control trial means that we were unlikely to really anticipate very deep learning. We imagine deep learning comes from playing the game over a protracted period of time, so 1 chapter a week, that rather than just 1 chapter a day, that actually allows young people time for contemplation to consolidate their learning. We'd also anticipate that young people can actually replay each of the chapters under normal conditions to test out the likely consequences of the decisions they make during gameplay that Adam talked about earlier. We've also developed a suite of curriculum activities in our facilitator manual, which Pretty will talk to you about very shortly. And these provide opportunities for peer learning that will help scaffold the learning from the game. And if we were to adopt all of these, we envisaged the game and the curriculum activities used in combination as they would be in practice, that we would hope to see far greater, more sustained impacts in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Nadia and Sam, taking us through what can sometimes feel a little complicated in terms of the data analysis, but I'm hoping that the audience has moved along with you nicely to understand that although the game perhaps didn't quite have the huge impact that we'd have loved it to, it's understandable given the fact that, you know, pupils have perhaps paid 2.5 hours in 1 week under quite strict conditions. So thank you.
I suppose what we're actually saying is we're not saying that the impacts that have been seen are, you know, low or anything like that. Actually, I think we are saying the opposite. What we're saying is these are quite encouraging, considering that this is step one of a process that's going to look quite different down the line. And to say that actually all we were doing within these game trials, we're looking at how the video game itself impacts on young people. Actually, what we found, I think, is very positive findings.
Yeah. I say quiet optimism. I mean, we're shouting from the rooftops.
That's better. That's better.
We're not that.
And I think what the conference, as it continues, will allow the audience to hear is those anecdotal stories from the young people, because one of the best things about game trial was actually standing in classrooms just listening to the young people play the game. You know, and the audacity of James leaving Danielle on read only and not replying, and a young man who came to me said, "Miss, it's better than FIFA." And now I'm not sure that this was a guy who really enjoyed football, but it was just lovely to hear their experiences and their joy at actually being involved in something whereby it wasn't, you know, the traditional way of learning. And so we'll come to that as we move through. But thank you for that. I'm going to introduce, I don't think we have, just check, I don't think we have any questions. No, we don't. So thank you so much for that.